Thank you for staying with us. Now, as the West maintains pressure on Russia following its invasion of Ukraine almost 5 months ago, Russia has gone on a charm offensive, engaging African countries, some of which voted for Russia to withdraw from Ukraine during the March 3rd UN General Assembly. Sergey Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has recently returned from a 4-nation tour of the African continent. All this activity alongside French President Emmanuel Macron's 3 African nation visit, which began in Cameroon earlier this week. Earlier, I spoke to head of the African Governance and Diplomacy Program at the South African Institute of International Affairs, Steve Groost, on the implications of the visit by the feuding countries.
In my view, this is part of a charm offensive. It's part of Russia trying to show that it's not isolated by the Western sanctions that have been imposed after its invasion of Ukraine. And it is a show of diplomatic force, that Russia has friends. What better PR can there be than Minister Lavrov shaking hands with presidents and prime ministers and foreign ministers? It's also been an opportunity for Russia to put its own side of the narrative forward, its own story, that this war, for example, is the result of NATO expansion, and that the food crisis that Africa is facing is not Russia's fault, but the fault of the sanctions, for example.
So is it about Russia solidifying friendships, or is it also about Russia making new friends with African countries?
So all the countries that Lavrov visited are countries that already have quite a strong relationship with Russia. Egypt, for example, is building a new nuclear power plant that the Russians are financing, and it has good relations with the other countries. So it's not necessarily finding new friends, but it's deepening relations with old friends. It's as significant where he didn't go. He didn't come to South Africa. He didn't go to Nigeria. He didn't go to Kenya, some of the leading and most important countries. So I think it was going to friends where he knew he would get a good reception, and a good reception is what he got.
But Uganda has been a neutral country in all of this. All of this has been happening, particularly when you look at the Russia-Ukraine war. Where do they stand, firstly? And secondly, as a charm offensive, what is Russia attempting to get from these African countries?
So Uganda, like many countries, says it's neutral on this war. But many would say it's leaning towards the Soviet Union, towards Russia. President Museveni said that you won't choose our enemies for us, we'll choose our own enemies, and we'll pursue our own interests. I mean, I think African countries are seeking approval from one of the great powers. Russia doesn't ask too many questions about the regime, about the governance system in these particular countries, and some have been sliding down the democratic rankings over the years, and so they like a partner that's not going to ask questions. I think the main purpose from the Russian side was to show that it's not isolated, to show that it still has friends and can still draw a crowd. This wasn't a trip where we saw big business deals being inked, for example. Those have happened, and they continue to happen. But one must also put into perspective that Russia's presence on the continent is much smaller than the traditional Western powers. It's about 1/10 the size in economic terms of China's presence. So, we should also keep this in perspective. But the fact is, this visit happened in the middle of the Russia-Ukraine war and has really got diplomatic and public relations elements that are driving it.
Well, let's juxtapose Russia to the rest of Europe with a particular emphasis on Emmanuel Macron, and we know that he too is courting a number of countries on the African continent.
Yes, he's taken a visit at the moment. In fact, he said that Russia is a colonial power, and a lot of the rhetoric around both of their trips has been around colonialism. Russia asserts that it's never been a colonial power. It's never been a colonial power in Africa, and offers something different. Some might say it was the biggest land empire in the world, and it's colonized most of its neighbors over the centuries. So yes, the US has sent some top diplomats to Ethiopia as well. So there is definitely a battle for the hearts and minds of African leaders and African publics.
Well, when we look at Emmanuel Macron, we look at the challenges that he's had with countries such as Mali, for instance, where the French and most of Europe have fallen out of favor. Is this an effort to mend some of those relations, or the grand perceptions that Africa has on former colonial powers, particularly when you look at France.
Yes, I mean, France plays a huge role in Africa, and I think they were quite shocked when the ambassador was thrown out of Mali. The fact is, they haven't been able to stop terrorism across the Sahel, from Senegal in the west all the way to the Horn of Africa and Djibouti and Somalia in the east. We've seen a wave of terror attacks that don't always make the news in South Africa or in other countries. But the French have been there with their troops for many, many years, and the Russians have come in to kind of expect that dissatisfaction. The channel Russia Today, or RT as it's now known, broadcasts in French now. It has a very huge Facebook following, for example. So the war, the battle is on, not only on the battlefield, but also in cyberspace and for the hearts and minds of the public. So, yes, I think Russia is taking advantage of French weakness, if you call it, or inability to really deliver to citizens what they were expecting. And Russia is positing itself as an alternative. We know that its private military companies are involved in Central African Republic, are involved in Mali. They were involved in Mozambique. These forces are an entry point for greater Russian influence on the continent.
Well, let's unpack this further with Cameroonian journalist Joel Kouam, who joins us now from Douala, and also joining us from Johannesburg via our video link is Dr. Charles Sinkala. He is the president of the Organization of African Political Parties Forum. Gentlemen, very good evening. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Joel, I'm going to start off with you. Now, 2 years ago, President Macron provoked President Biya's indignation after declaring he would apply maximum pressure on the president over intolerable violence. Now, talk to us about this particular visit. We know he's just been to Cameroon. Is this a make-up visit, or is there more to it?
Hello, thank you to welcome me to the show. First of all, we need to say that the visit was not about what he said 2 years ago, because when he was here, every topic who was supposed to put an embarrassment on the president, Biya, was avoided. And you can see that there was a perception during, for example, the press conference. Only French journalists asked 2 questions. Only 2 French journalists succeeded to ask 2 questions to the Cameroonian president. They were talking about the same thing. Will you be able to represent yourself to the 2025 election? That was the only question. So on the agenda, there were no question of talking about human rights violation, opposition leader, political opponent who are in jail since 2000, since some 4 years now, since the recent election. So Macron was here to talk specifically about economy, agriculture, and much about what is going on between Ukraine and Russia and the impact on the economy of Africa and on the agriculture especially. Yeah. So he made everything to avoid all those topics who were supposed to, put the president and Cameroonian people in.
Dr. Sinkala, if I could just pick up from where Joel has left off, this about turn or turning of a blind eye to some of those issues that Emmanuel Macron 2 years ago spoke out against is a little bit curious, do you not think?
Yeah, it is, yes, one can think like that. And firstly, I would like to say thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss these issues on the continent. We must remember very well that that part of the West Africa, France is actually a shareholder for those countries, and they cannot avoid those countries. Even if the past 2 years he has been speaking against the regime, and as well as they have been suppliers of defense equipment and military equipment, and as well as soldiers to those regions. And I think there has been a competition between the 2 countries, Russia and France, in terms of supplying equipment to that area. But, his visit to that side is not something surprised. Emmanuel Macron and all other presidents who came before him has visited that region for many years because it is part of their economic hub. That's where they benefit in terms of taxes and colonial taxes and other trade engagement.
Now, let's move away from President Macron and France specifically and talk a little bit about Russia. Now, Russia similarly is on its own charm offensive, visiting a number of African countries. Now, in your opinion, are we likely to see a shift in allegiance, particularly from Francophone countries to Russia, for instance? Or is this hard and fast? Is it done and dusted? Is it always going to be the allegiance between France and her former colonies?
Russia has got its own interest. Africa has been hosting a lot of visitors for the past 300 years. We have had explorers, we had faith-based organizations, people came to bring religion in the continent, and as well as we have had businessmen, terrorists and tourists, and many others who come here for different interests. Russia also, as well as, is not isolated. It's got its own interest in the relationship between Africa and its stake, especially in terms of the conflicts between Russia and Ukraine, and how the sanctions has been sanctioned to Russia, and how they would like to reverse these sanctions to economies such as the West economies and the United States of America economies. That's why their partnership with the African continent, especially those who voted against the reprimand of Russia and those who abstained, has been strategically being placed. I think there's some talks in terms of the economical, financial markets. If at all the West and the United States of America are looking at opportunities to explore, to redirect their supplies, their sourcing of either gas or oil and other products from Africa rather than from Russia, so that they can incapacitate Russia. And as well, Russia is playing the same game of the war. They will also protect their interest. And I think we can see how the financial markets are indicating in Europe and as well as the United States of America. The fuel prices are skyrocketing as well as the food basket. So to some extent, United States of America shall succumb to those sanctions that have been imposed on Russia. They will actually, in reality, they have imposed those sanctions by themselves, because the effect on the economy in the United States of America and Europe, it's quite threatening at this moment. Russia
Dr. Sinkala, if you allow me to come in there and just give a moment for Joel to answer my next question. Joel, there's an issue around security in Cameroon. Obviously, a number of insurgents, there's ethnic violence. Is France expected to play a part in quelling this violence? Is the first question. And the second question is, we know what France wants from Cameroon. Does Cameroon in turn have any expectations from France?
What we can say, obviously, is that Cameroon is not expecting something very much from France for now, since we know we are facing three main crises. First of all, in the far north region, the crisis with Boko Haram, main insurgency were coming from Nigeria and Chad, Niger. The crisis containing five countries: Niger, Chad, Cameroon, and also some neighboring countries. There is another main crisis which Cameroon is also facing and which is very severe. It is the Anglophone crisis. The Anglophone crisis has made more than 700 people to fly out inside the country, and more than 50,000 people to fly out in Nigeria due to the crisis. And some people have some voices, some activists here have been saying that there is the hand of France in those crises, especially the one of Boko Haram, a sort of kind of destabilization. According to them, the France is trying to destabilize the regime which is in place in Yaoundé. You know that Paul Biya, it is in power since more than 30 years now, and we don't know if the man intends to represent himself for the next 2025 election. So that is the fact. We are facing the crisis in the far north region. due to insurgency, and we're facing the crisis in the Anglophone region. So last April, Cameroon signed a military partnership with Russia. In fact, they renewed the partnership that were existing with Russia. And according to some experts, it is due to that France have decided, the French President Macron have decided to come to Cameroon, maybe to try to curb that kind of contestation, because there is a wave of French contestation which is rising in some days, in some months now, in some African countries. You have seen.
Joel, I'm afraid we're going to have to stop it there. We have indeed run out of time, but appreciate your time this evening. Joel Kouam is a journalist, and he's speaking to us from Douala in Cameroon, and Dr. Charles Sinkala, Organization of African Political Parties Forum, and he's speaking to us from here in Johannesburg. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time this evening. Now, coming up, we'll be bringing you news that's been making the headlines still on the African continent. Don't go away.